Today is Thanksgiving Sunday, but it's also Christ the King Sunday. It's a time to look back over the past year as you've walked with the Spirit. It's a time where you can wish one another Happy New Year, just a little bit early, because the church year begins in earnest next Sunday. Christian worship year does begin with the first Sunday of Advent, which is next week, and then it follows with the life of Jesus through his birth, through his ministry, his arrest, trial, resurrection, ascension. And then that brings us back to Pentecost, where the church is born, and we spend the rest of the year thinking about what it means to carry that title, Christian. And hopefully we gather together today at the end of all that with a pretty clear understanding of what it means for us to claim that Jesus Christ is King. For the most part, we aren't newbies on that journey. And next Sunday, as I said, we start all over again. And the thing is that even though the sequence of the calendar is the same, you shouldn't be in the same place today that you were 365 days ago. We all should have grown, even just a little bit. We all should have changed. We should have picked up on some insights that have helped us see that world around us with a little more clarity. We should have come a little bit closer to being the people that God has called us to be. So, how are you doing this morning? Do you feel a need maybe to get a little jump on your New Year's resolutions? The truth is, it's not easy being the people of God. That can be a kind of a heavy title for us to carry. Sometimes people of God is so foreboding that we look for different words to explain it. I kind of like the terminology family of faith. That just has a little bit different feel to it, doesn't it? And it fits pretty well into this national Thanksgiving focus of the week, a focus on our families coming together, on the blessings that God has given to us, on all those things that we have to be thankful for as we gather around a feast table together, as you're going to be doing here on Thursday. Are you getting kind of a Norman Rockwell painting coming to your mind as you think about that? I grew up with Captain Kangaroo, and back in the day on Thanksgiving, they always in the treasure house had a Thanksgiving dinner, and they served one another. In the background, they would bring up the Norman Rockwell painting of the family gathering together while they sang, "We Gathered Together to Ask the Lord's Blessing." It was really like that on TV way back when probably still black and white. The church I served in Nebraska had a young adults fellowship group when I was there, and maybe young adults was a bit of a misrepresentation, but the group had regular activities just to have fun together. And one night, we took a school bus up to Kearney, Nebraska, the nearby town that had a state university branch located there, and we were all going to see a basketball game together. And the plan was we'd be in this bus with about 20 or 30 of us and drive up to Kearney and have a meal, then go over and watch the basketball game. Well, we went from parking lot to parking lot trying to find a place that was going to be able to accommodate a group that size. Nobody had thought to call ahead for reservations. And finally, after about the fourth attempt at checking out availability, my friend John rolled down the bus window and shouted at the cars in a full parking lot, "Don't you people have homes?" Now, I want to be clear that John is a great guy with a big heart. But I can't tell you how many times his words of frustration have popped into my head, especially during this season of the year. When we think of coming home for Thanksgiving, it seems like there are always issues that kind of blur that Norman Rockwell painting just a little bit. We live in a time when it's often a rare thing for immediate family to sit down for a meal together at all. And a homecoming of relatives for a feast might only happen once a year because we are so spread out. And sometimes it can be years before we get everybody together. So there's catching up to do. And as the family sits down around the table, we realize that not everyone around the table is on the same page, sharing the same views and opinions. You know what I'm talking about, right? So there's awkward silences. There's some nervous clearing of the throat. The family can feel fragmented. And the house where we gather doesn't feel too much like home. So Thanksgiving and homecoming can be hard. Being a family in those circumstances can be hard. Being a church family can be hard. Sometimes we struggle to remain a family. Some don't like this feeling of home. Some look at the church and they don't feel like they could ever be part of that family or join us around this table, our communion table. So it's hard sometimes when we gather together, when we invite others to gather with us, to feel thankful. So what are we missing with this whole home thing? It's not a new issue. God's people, the house of Israel, struggled mightily to try and be a home. As you read Scripture, it sometimes becomes evident, it quickly becomes evident that there are lots of people who didn't feel welcome or a part of that family. There were all sorts of lines that could not be crossed, that separated those who were in from those who were out. There wasn't a place for them in the house. And it was made very clear to them that they did not belong. This story of Zacchaeus from Luke's Gospel is a prime example. It takes place as Jesus is traveling to Jericho, and on the way, he'd stopped to heal a blind man, and that was a really big deal. The crowds were following him as he entered into the city, and you can imagine the ruckus. It's not every day that someone has their sight restored, and the word traveled quickly, and everybody wanted to get a glimpse of Jesus, to get a feel for who this man was. So this crowd surrounding him is winding its way through the streets of Jericho, through the neighborhood of a tax collector, a rich tax collector, Luke is quick to say, named Zacchaeus. How many of you remember the song? Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, right? Well, Luke tells us a little bit more about him. He was a tax collector, Luke says, and he was rich. And because he was a little guy, crowds were a problem for him. But you get the feeling that even if he was a solid 6 foot, the crowds would still be in his way, because they'd be doing everything in their power to make his life miserable. After all, he was a tax collector. Tax collectors were the bottom feeders of society in Jesus' day. Everybody hated the tax collector. I'm glad that's changed, right? They were hated because they collected taxes for Rome, the enemy. And Luke writes that he was rich, so he was evidently good at his job. And he probably got that way by charging his neighbors more than they were owed in taxes and keeping the overage for himself. And that was okay for Rome. That was one of the benefits of being a tax collector. As much as you could get away with, you'd push the limits. So Zacchaeus himself was probably a Jew, which made his situation even worse. It made him even more despised, not only by his neighbors, but by the Romans as well, because they viewed him as a turncoat even to his own people. As far as the crowd surrounding Jesus was concerned, this lowlife had nothing in common with Jesus, so why in the world would he want to even have a chance to take a look at him? So you might know the story. To get a better view, he climbs up into a sycamore tree. What a sight that must have been, right? The crowd surrounding him must have been laughing. Folks who heard the story firsthand, when Jesus first told it, when Luke first shared it, probably were laughing as well, because men of wealth and position, no matter how they're viewed, they just don't climb trees. But Jesus isn't laughing. Jesus is inviting. The song says, Zacchaeus, what? You come down, for I'm going to your house today. That's how the song goes. And the reading quotes Jesus as saying, I must stay at your house today. In other words, let's hang out. Let's get to know each other. Let's eat. That's how a host cares for a guest. And when the crowds heard that, they started to grumble, as crowds always do. He's gone to be the guest of one who's a sinner. And Jesus and Zacchaeus went and sat down at the table together. Evidently, Zacchaeus had a house. He had a place to be. He had a place to escape the hatred and the ridicule of his neighbors. But I have this picture in my mind of him going into his house at the end of the day, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was following him, closing the door behind him and throwing a triple lock for safety. That's how much he was part of the neighborhood. Not much of a home, right? So the last thing he expected as he sat up there in that tree was to have Jesus invite himself to dinner. And Luke says he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. What a picture. This little guy scampering down, almost falling off the lower branch because he's so excited, and showing genuine joy that someone would want to come to his house. Jesus made Zacchaeus' house a home. And while the crowd grumbled at Jesus' choice, Jesus reminded them that Zacchaeus was also a son of Abraham. Zacchaeus was also a member of the family. He also was as worthy of God's grace as they were. And that's the key word in this whole passage, grace. The crowd grumbled because they didn't feel that Zacchaeus was good enough. They didn't feel that he deserved to be in the presence of one like Jesus. They felt he'd fallen short. No pun intended. That he was a sinner. He may have been a member of the house, but it wasn't home for him. But Jesus changed all that. All who saw it began to grumble. They were almost saying, don't you people have homes? Go away and find them, they would grumble. You don't have any right or any privilege to be here with us. Go to your own house. But Jesus came and reframed the question. If it feels like you don't have a place, Jesus said, I have come to prepare a place for you. His purpose was to seek and to save the lost, as Luke points out. Folks who were on the outside for whatever reason. Folks who had no home, no family, no community. Those things that we all seek, those things that we all strive for. When you read this familiar passage of Scripture, and when you take a look at the folks' reaction to the message of Jesus, the question Jesus is most asked is, what do I have to do to be part of this family? Just a chapter or two before this story, the rich young ruler came to Jesus and asked him, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus' answer has nothing to do with signing off on a long list of do's and don'ts. Even though you might recall that rich young ruler said, I've followed all the commandments, I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. And what was Jesus' answer? Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he defines a neighbor even as one that you might despise the most. Like I said, coming around the table is hard. It's really hard. Zacchaeus' house became a home once Jesus stayed there. If grumbling has made your Thanksgiving table feel less like home, Jesus can make your house home by making room for him at the table. Jesus promises to make this house a home when you give him the best seat in the house, worthy of a king, and being thankful that he's chosen to be here. My friend John was frustrated because there wasn't enough table space to have a meal. And he shouted out, "Don't you people have homes?" We've already been so richly blessed by God's grace and God's love. And we have the promise that there's always room at the table for more. We can't outlove the Lord. So, when we're tempted to shout, may our shout be more of an invitation. Don't you people have homes? Well then, come and celebrate with us. Jesus is here, and this house is now his home. And friends, what more could we possibly be thankful for than that gift of good?